You think you've changed. You hadn't. You staged a makeover for the same self and called it change. You swapped the furniture, opened a different window, and declared a new climate. The air smelled new because you burned incense over the same rod. The measurements are familiar. The temperature is the same. The story is different because the narrator learned a fresher tone. You parade new language across an old floor. You test drive slogans that fit well on your mouth. You record promises with a better microphone and insist the audio quality proves evolution. You hold up artifacts, different routines, revised diets, fresh contacts, and use them as alibis for a crime that never stopped. The crime is continuity disguised as momentum. You enjoy ceremonials, rituals of purging, rituals of starting, rituals of declaring. You archive screenshots of milestones that left the core untouched. The archive grows sleek. It functions as evidence for a jury that only you convene. The verdict never changes because the case is misfiled. You litigate aesthetics. You ignore structure. The sentence is suspended because you know how to sound convincing when you ask for more time. You adjusted your silhouette to win new angles, not to alter the spine. The spine remains the old code executed with better manners. You negotiate with mirrors. The mirrors are docile and cooperative. They agree to reflect your latest version as truth if you provide the right lighting. You provide it. You never permit fluorescence. You avoid the brutal light that exposes repeated seams. You say you took accountability. You narrate regrets like a professional reading legal statements. You cite lessons in present reconciliations. The words are forged in calm temper. The performance earns you a reputation for depth. The depth is a painted backdrop. It photographs well. It buckles if leaned against. Nobody leans because your tone has become a perimeter. You cling to visible differences because they reassure spectators. Spectators were always your chosen audience. They applaud periodic refreshes. They do not demand an untelevised substitution at the level of nerve. You stay faithful to the version of you that knows how to be liked. You deliver generous gestures that avoid the friction of unlikable truth. You are not conflicted about this. You are loyal. You speak of thresholds crossed. The threshold is a revolving door. You enjoy the rotation. You can be seen moving without ever entering a room that locks behind you. You tracked your rotations in immaculate journals. The entries produce the sensation of growth without the trauma of emergence. You prefer sensation to consequence. You mistake the former for the latter because they look similar in reflection. You optimize etiquette around your old refusal. You present courtesy as change. You are kinder. You are calmer. You are more self-aware. You are also identical where it matters. The identical part is the switch you flip at the first sign of irreversible consequence. The finger finds the switch faster now. The casing is polished. The motion is silent. You applaud yourself for the silence. You exit the hard moment in new ways. You exit by educating instead of escalating, by nodding instead of naming, by curating instead of confronting. The exit is still the religion. You headed hymns. The hymns mention honesty, integrity, values, clarity. The God never changes. The ritual masks are exquisite. You refuse to notice that the altar is the same stone. You think you made amends with reality. You made amends with optics. You engineered a look that signals adjustment without requiring reconfiguration. You learned to operate smoother. Smoother is your industry. It keeps glass between you and the event. You do not pick up the mess because the mess would stain the narrative. You invest further in the glass and marvel that you cut yourself less. You announce that you outgrew certain people, places, impulses. You did. You outgrew the ones that threatened to expose continuity. You kept the ones that serve your continuity well. They are safe, supportive, and harmonious with your brand. Your brand is the perimeter that keeps impact away from you while keeping praise within easy reach. You calibrate the ratio skillfully. You confuse calibration with courage. Courage would have required the death of this ratio. You never make the dangerous admission. You learn to compensate for repetition with quality control. You eliminate obvious failures, glaring inconsistencies, juvenile tells. The advanced tells remain and grow sophisticated. Sophistication is your cover story. It would rather be right than real. Being right requires citation. Being real requires scar. You lost interest in scars. You frame them. The glass never fogs. You claim that time worked on you. Time does not work on anything that refuses to be handled. You protected yourself from the press that transforms. You allowed time to wash over a surface with a protective coating. The coating shines. It is not a metaphor. It is a lacquer you apply every quarter and call maturity. You deliver this sheen to onlookers, and they say you glow. You glow because nothing penetrates. You treat your old habits like an exiled regime you replaced. The regime never left. It just trained your new police. The uniforms changed. The strategy did not. The same law governs every street you walk. Preserve plausible deniability. The vocabulary differs. The enforcement is faithful. You congratulate the uniforms for their tone. You ignore that the prison population has remained the same. You reclassify avoidance as minimalism, caution as ethics, invisibility as respect, delay as research, gentleness as wisdom, and self-erasure as sacrifice. The reclassification is modern, persuasive, and marketable. It sells. It sells because the world buys anything that looks like responsibility on camera. Off camera, your footprint is unchanged. You learn to tread in designer shoes. The soil never notices. You collect testimonies. They testify to versions of you that you actively manufactured for their eyes. The testimonies are not false. They are partial by design. You distribute them at strategic times. You wield them as shields against your own suspicion. The suspicion speaks plainly in the middle of the night. You orchestrated a parade where the floats were painted with the same paint you refused to strip. The parade route never altered. You argue that the difference is intent. Intent is your sanctuary. It allows you to remain the protagonist of a narrative where the plot is interior and the outcomes are irrelevant. You preach the virtue of slow. You are correct that speed can be a lie. Your slow is a disguise for non-entry. You proved it by accumulating expectations that never matured into demands on your shape. You set limits and called it sovereignty. The limits encircle the only areas where friction would have erupted and forced a rewrite. Everything else remains negotiable because it does not threaten your core allegiance. You feared that real change would disfigure your identity beyond recognition. You are correct. You are married to recognizability. You crave mirrors that greet you by name. You do not risk walking past one that stares blankly and waits for you to introduce yourself. You became a scholar of your own pattern. You published internal reports nobody else read. The reports were glowing. The methodology was flawed. You refused random sampling of moments that count, and instead tested yourself in controlled conditions you knew you could pass. You passed. You framed your certificate and placed it near the door for the next version's tour. You rebrand recurrence as seasonality. You call it cyclical intelligence. You say you move in spirals and come back higher. The spiral is tight. The height is minor and cosmetic. The radius keeps you safe from the point. You never descend into a latitude where the sky changes. You fly above a map you never touch. You narrate the terrain with confidence because you have memorized it. You pretend this is mapping. It is recitation. Sign the verdict, unchanged. Your operating system never updated. You changed the wallpaper and added extensions that make the interface look novel. Beneath, the kernel remained unmodified. It boots the same priorities in the same order every time pressure enters the room. The first priority is not truth. The first priority is preservation of the familiar self-image. Everything else is a subordinate process. The familiar self-image is not random. It is an inheritance optimized for praise and protection. It is an organism that lives on plausible escape routes. It tolerates discomfort, so long as discomfort does not threaten origin myths. The myths are clean and sentimental. They grant you exemptions from choices that would put you at odds with your history. You worship exemptions dressed as values. You never call them what they are, because naming exposes the trick. When a demand arises, your system runs a series of predictive tests. Simulation A. What will this do to the narrative I sell to myself about being principled and considerate? Simulation B. What will this do to the narrative I sell to others about being competent and safe? Simulation C. How reversible is this choice if I need to retreat under the pretense of recalibration? Simulation D. How will this be documented to reinforce the museum of change? The simulations do not ask whether the act is true. They ask whether the act can be staged without altering the lead character. You maintain a press office inside your head. It issues statements before events occur. It pre-writes apologies and justifications set to trigger upon contact with heat. The statements are crafted to appease internal critics you handpicked for their softness. They sound rigorous because you trained them to speak in the language of responsibility. The language is theater. The show runs continuously. The stagehands never sleep. Underneath the press office is a customs checkpoint. Every impulse must pass through and declare purpose. The checkpoint inspects for contraband, zeal that could burn bridges, declarations that remove options, choices that invite measurement, lines that draw heat. Contraband is confiscated and reissued as tasteful alternatives. A scream becomes a statement. A demand becomes a preference. A stand becomes a posture. You present the paperwork to yourself and wave yourself through with a smile that feels like safety. The safety is false. It is an engineered climate that maintains stable temperature so that no reaction reaches activation energy. You live just below the threshold where things fuse. The threshold becomes sacred. You guard it by curating fatigue, caution, empathy, foresight, anything that can be weaponized to justify not crossing. The weapons look like virtues in photographs. In the dark, they are dull, heavy instruments used to smash every match that threatens to light. The role you replay is the curator of controlled divergence. You tolerate deviation in the margins to prove openness, while preserving the spine untouched. You encourage small upheavals where they do not implicate the idol you protect. You bring guests to these corners and demonstrate your adaptability. You never take them to the temple. The temple is untouchable. The altar bears the inscription you never erase. I must remain recognizable to myself at all times. You also replay the penitent performer. You confess with grace. You exhibit remorse with art. You deliver lessons that walk softly into other people's ears. Your contrition earns you a second wind without paying the fee of demolition. The audience is moved. The audience grants you absolution. The absolution refreshes your license to continue operating as before, under the halo of someone who learned. The learning leaves your behavior unscarred. Another role is the reformer in perpetual draft. You publish new declarations that are almost persuasive. You launch initiatives that get close enough to taste the air of change without swallowing it. The bureaucracy hums. Calendars fill. Prototypes are displayed. A round of applause arrives. You return to base and hang the banner from another angle. The banner is the same. The angle is new. You are satisfied because the photograph looks different. You design fail-safes that activate when a choice threatens to trap you in consequence. The fail-safes are invisible outside. Internally, they are robust. They monitor for words like irreversible, public, accountable, exclusive, binding, names attached. When any of these appear, a quiet alarm moves you toward dilute options. Pseudo-choices with escape hatches, vague commitments with elastic deadlines, agreements that only exist if nobody looks too closely. You are a master of fog. The fog is not accidental. It is manufactured by your editorial filter. The filter sits between raw impulse and expressed intent. It sands off edges that would cut a new shape into your life. It leaves a soft, rounded statement that returns to the default when pressed. The default is an elegant wait state. Waiting is your default, not because patience is wise, but because waiting maintains identity while borrowing the dignity of restraint. You avoid the audit that matters. You audit tone. You audit optics. You audit alignment. You avoid auditing outcomes. The outcome remains distant because you designed your metrics to reward the presentation of process. You celebrate proof of intent and ignore proof of impact. You know how to speak about this gap with sophistication. You have already prepared lines that perform awareness as a substitute for change. You recite them with a face that implies gravity. The gravity is synthetic. Your social configuration rewards this. You select witnesses who will affirm that the new book cover means a new book. They repeat your lines back to you and add gloss. Their belief becomes your evidence. You show them just enough to sustain the myth of transformation. They do not ask for chapters because you trained them not to. They value your ease. Your ease is preserved. Everyone leaves the room with the impression that a crossing occurred. The border stands where it was. Under strain, your system leans harder into self-referentiality. You talk about how far you have come. You narrate distance traveled through interior landscapes. Only you can verify. The scale is private and manipulable. You set it to flatter. It reads favorable numbers. You recognize what you are doing and allow it because it keeps the music low enough to sleep. You prefer sleep to the shock of a true wake-up because waking would require a scene. You learn to stockpile half-finished versions of yourself. They are leverage. They protect you from accountability because you can always point to the workshop and say you are in development. You are always in development. You never release. You prefer teasers to premieres because teasers are all promise and no criticism. Critics require a product. You keep your product as a secret to keep your status unblemished by reality. The secret is that the product does not exist. Your body participates in the lie by providing cues that mimic the sensation of change. Novelty floods you with chemicals that simulate progress. You interpret chemical storms as milestones. The storms pass. You chalk it up to cycles. You signal rest and recovery. You never resume because resumption would force you to compare intention with debris. You avoided debris by never breaking ground. The lot is pristine. The neighborhood ages. There is a finance department underneath your decisions. It pays out in relief and hoards praise as capital. It treats risk as a debt that can only be serviced by small, symbolic payments. It never pays principal. Interest accrues. A creeping sense of hollowness, a pressure you label as complexity. A vague fatigue that comes from defending a position in a war that only you wage against reality. You consider the fatigue as proof of growth. It is interest. The principal remains due. You will not pay. The theater of reform is not random. It runs on a calendar. The calendar syncs with external events that offer convenient scaffolds for reinvention. Birthdays, job changes, relationships, relocations, illnesses, recoveries, seasonal markers. You hitch your narrative to these and perform synchronization like skill. The theater is timely. The script does not change because the playwright refuses to kill their favorite character. The you who is almost different and always intact. You hold a silent contract with yourself to remain understandable to your past. You refuse moves that would make your old self into a stranger. You act only within the parameters that a previous version would applaud. You call this loyalty. It is nostalgia enforced as law. It prevents exile from your own history. Exile would disorient your identity. Disorientation is the precondition for real change. You solved it by never stepping far enough to lose the horizon you memorized. You elevate palatable struggles as your defining battles. They are winnable without force. They end in ceremonies that photograph well. They produce gentle applause and do not require anyone to redraw lines in their head about who you are. You avoid the grotesque, the unmarketable, the bad-looking ruptures that are unavoidable when a person stops serving their original myth. You avoid humiliation. You avoid mess. You avoid victory that looks like a crime scene. You argue nuance to strangle necessity. You unfold every issue until it becomes too dignified to act upon. Action feels crude amid so much analysis. Crudeness would jeopardize your image as refined. The refinement is a cage populated with adjectives. You barter adjectives among friends like currencies. You forget that nouns build worlds. You reject nouns because nouns pin you. Adjectives flow. You prefer flow. You drown elegantly. The engine of sameness inside you is modest. It does not announce itself with dramatic commands. It hums softly and repeats two directives: protect recognizability, preserve exits. These directives route every choice through familiar corridors. You travel them while narrating detours. You claim surprise at arriving in the same district. The map says you never left. You know the map is correct. You redraw the legend so it becomes plausible that the same place now has a new name. The line between awareness and transformation is the line you will not cross. You found a way to make awareness productive enough to be admired and sterile enough to be safe. You curate insights like collector's items. Each one is tagged and shelved. Visitors marvel. The collection grows. The vault deepens. The museum prospers. Outside, nothing shifts. The street learns to expect your soft luminosity and your durable absence. Your claim to change rests on consistent improvements to your performance as a considerate subject. Consideration is your currency. You spend it to purchase tolerances from others. They tolerate your delay because your delay is polite. They tolerate your non-arrival because your non-arrival is beautifully explained. They tolerate your refusal because your refusal is a work of art. You are solvent in social markets and bankrupt where contact with fate is priced high. You route decisions through distance. Distance is your anesthetic. You keep everything at a scale you can narrate. Anything that shrinks down to the size where it could pierce you is scaled back up with rhetoric until pressure dissipates. You insist that perspective saves lives. Here, perspective saves a version of you that does not deserve to live. The version that deserves to live is the one condemned by your perspective as too costly to maintain. You save the wrong life on purpose. Change is not your goal. Continuity disguised as change is. It allows you to claim evolution while protecting your core privileges. The right to withdraw without repercussion. The right to be liked without proof. The right to avoid forming edges that could cut both ways. You keep those rights intact. You design your environment to require nothing else from you. You are efficient at this. You are proud of this. Your legacy, if unaltered, will be a stack of immaculate preludes. People will remember the promise and the polish. They will search for the artifact that matches the museum's size and fail to find it. They will be kind about the absence because you trained them to be. Kindness will be the last curtain you draw across the empty stage. You will let it fall smoothly. Quiet expertise. Perfect lighting. No dust. You are not a mystery. You are a pattern wearing new clothes. The fabric changes and the cut improves. The posture remains loyal to an origin story that has outlived its usefulness. You think you have changed because the mirror agrees. The mirror is your lowest bidder. It sells you back your favorite lie at wholesale. You keep buying. The price is everything you pretend to be ready to lose. You never pay. Answer to your real name. Continuity in costume.